Well, good afternoon. I have asked for an opportunity to speak with members of the press this morning. I've got a legislative package that we're entitling the Oil Spill Compensation Act of 2010 that I am in the process of introducing. I had actually hoped to be able to introduce it this morning. I've just come back from a trip to Alaska, and as part of that trip, I was in the community of Cordova for Saturday evening and Sunday. And Cordova, as you may recall, was directly impacted by the Exxon Valdez tragedy some 21 years ago. And I had an opportunity to speak to so many in the community that were involved with actually drafting of OPA 90, the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. Got great input from them about the regional advisory councils that we have in place in Alaska now that really work on the preparedness end of how we deal with any impact caused by oil to our local communities. So I've pulled back from introducing today because I want to incorporate some of these provisions from very not only knowledgeable individuals, but people that speak from a point of reference that I think we stand to benefit from in following their advice. But what we have in place thus far with the legislation and what I am working with my colleagues to advance, again, is an Oil Spill Compensation Act that deals with so many areas of what we're seeing with the situation in the Gulf. We would provide for compensation for those that are affected by the Deepwater Horizon spill in a fair and a fast manner by establishing the option for an expedited administrative claims process. This is in place of litigation, and if you'll recall, it was just this last year that the litigation claims were resolved with Exxon Valdez. Nobody should have to go through what the people of Alaska went through when it comes to resolution of their claims. So we put in place this expedited administrative process. It would allow that it would not be BP that is establishing the validity of the claims. It would be through an independent administrator. There is a timeliness process. There's an appeals process. But again, I think it's very important as we see things unfold with those who have been damaged in the Gulf, the frustration that they have in going through the process. So we need to have an open and clear process and a very expedited process so that we can get compensation to those quickly. We also establish a strong and a credible bipartisan commission to investigate the incident, make policy recommendations going forward. I've been asked, well, how does this differ from what the President is suggesting? We would have this commission be bipartisan. They would have subpoena powers, so it just gives it a little more oomph. One area that I think is incredibly critical is to establish some rational guidelines and criteria for presidential rulemaking on the strict liability limits for economic damages for the various operations in the OCS. There's been a great deal of discussion about the liability caps. Right now we're at $75 million. It's been suggested it needs to be increased to $10 billion. It's suggested that it should be unlimited. Rather than just pull a number out of the air, after the hearing that we held in the Energy Committee and in discussion with folks within the administration and others, what we are looking to put in place is setting liability limits on economic damages based on a series of factors. And there's about a dozen factors that would be placed into statute, not the least of which the record and historical number of regulatory violations of the leaseholder. Other factors, the water depth of the lease, the projected well depth of the lease, the proximity of the lease to oil and gas emergency response equipment, the likelihood of the offshore facility to encounter broken sea ice. Obviously in Alaska we're looking at things a little bit differently than in the Gulf. looking at other things like the estimated well pressure, economic values of non-energy coastal resources, whether or not the lease employs a subsea or surface blowout preventer stack. I think it's very important that we look at this critically and say there are areas that we know there is a higher risk when you go into the ultra deep. There is a higher risk when you're dealing with expanded pressures, and there are things that we should be looking at. Most of us who have automobile insurance know that if you've got a bad track record when it comes to your driving record, you're going to pay a higher insurance for that. Why would we not set up a similar system when it comes to the insurance and the liability component in the offshore? Other things that we include within this legislation: we restore and strengthen the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund. I had already introduced legislation with Senator Begich that would increase the tax on producers from the existing 8 cents, move it up to 9 cents. That's not going to be sufficient. We know that. We're proposing to bump it up to 21 cents. That brings in $1.5 billion into the trust fund per year. We need to have a $10 billion trust fund, and our provision would allow us to do that, provide additional flexibilities to quickly disperse the fund in the event of emergencies. We also provide additional funding and authority to the Coast Guard to conduct research and development for oil spill containment and response technology and capability. This is something that I think we have all looked to and said, where is the R&D when it comes to response capability? Our technologies that allow us to drill out in the deepest of deep have gone quite dramatically, but has the level of response and preparedness, have those technologies kept pace? And I would suggest that they have not. So we've got a research and development piece in there. We restrict oil transportation in Arctic waters to pipelines rather than tankers. Again, very important from the Alaska perspective. And then we have, finally, we recognize the clear and present risks and impacts to coastal states which elect to participate in oil and gas development off their shores. So we put in place a revenue sharing component directing 37.5% of OCS oil and gas revenues to states and the affected communities. But it is a good package. To this point in time, as I mentioned, I do intend to add at least one more component that would relate to the community's participation through the regional advisory councils that we have in place in Alaska that have been quite effective, and working with my other colleagues, particularly those in the Gulf that have been so focused on these issues in the past 50, 57, 58 days now. So without any questions, I've talked far too long, but.
On the issue of the liability caps and the authority that you're giving the President here, I mean, what's to prevent the administration from deciding that it doesn't want a liability cap or setting the number so high that it would effectively be no cap at all?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. It's a legitimate. Suppose you have a president who just does not believe in offshore development and wants to use this as a tool to effectively cut it off by asserting that there shall be no limits in place. As this is currently drafted, you would not be tied to that. In other words, the President would have that flexibility to do so. There is another piece in here, though, that says that if there is an incident that goes beyond the liability cap that has been set by the President, that then what comes in place is the compensation, the economic compensation that shall be paid, will be collected from all of the other entities that operate in offshore facilities in the OCS at the date of the incident. So essentially, you are ensuring that there is no situation where the cap that is established would be exceeded and then there's nobody to pay. It would be an assessment on all those who operate in the OCS at the time of the incident.
So is this an idea similar to sort of a Price-Anderson
yes.
model that Senator Alexander's talked about?
Exactly, exactly. It's kind of that default, if you will, that provides for that level of surety in the event that you have an incident that goes far beyond what anybody had anticipated in terms of liability. it's an important piece, and I should have included that saying. Thank you. Anything else out there? Sir?
Can you give us a sense of how much support there is for the revenue sharing, the 37.5% number? Have you had discussions with other senators on this?
Well, as you know, this is Senator Landrieu's. I don't want to set what her priorities may be in terms of saying number one or whatever, but it is an issue that she has been a leader on over the years, and has done extraordinarily well in raising this issue. She again has reiterated that in the fallout of the Gulf disaster here, that those who suggested that perhaps there isn't additional risk that is taken by those states who host the offshore development, all they need to do is look at what is happening along the shores of Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi. And so we know that there will be some members that will probably continue to have the objections that they have had. But I think in terms of the public understanding the need and the importance of revenue sharing, I think that has changed in the face of the Deepwater Horizon spill.
In the overall bill, do you have any co-sponsors on this?
We are working to gain those co-sponsors now. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Libby?
VP Lamar McKay's testimony this morning before the House Subcommittee, when asked about creating an escrow account to pay out compensation and damage things, he seemed to reiterate instead that he thinks that the company can do as they've said, which is pay out all reasonable claims. What's your response to that?
Well, I'm looking at the writing on the wall. I think we will see. I don't know what's going to happen in the conversation that the president has with Mr. Hayward tomorrow, but I think that the push to give that level of assurance that these claims will be paid, and that essentially you would put in escrow funds from BP. My sense is that is going ahead. Now, I mentioned in the offset discussing my legislation that we would have this expedited claims process. It really doesn't make a difference from the perspective of what we have drafted if in fact they do move ahead with $20 billion or some other figure that's in an account. It could still be administered through the process that we have set up. But I think we're gonna see tomorrow the outcome of that conversation. But I think people are generally concerned. They see the economic cost of this spill being played out every day, and it's recognized that BP is a major company that has major assets, but I think it is also recognized that even the biggest of the big are not unlimited in terms of their resources, and there is a concern, well, what happens if BP is unable to pay? I think there is a request for that level of assurance, kind of fencing revenues off would allow for that. Obviously, the discussion about payment to BP shareholders of this next dividend coming up is, again, yet another question. I want to make sure that BP is there to pay the compensation that is due to the victims of this spill.
Senator, can we just jump back to last week to your resolution?
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering about particularly the Rockefeller bill. Just how confident are you that this will actually come to the floor within the next few months at least?
I am not confident because I have not had that conversation with Leader Reid. He's obviously the one that calls the shots on that. I understand that there has been an offer out there that the Rockefeller bill that would delay EPA by 2 years is out there floating. I have been given no assurance that that will in fact take place, and certainly no indication as to timing. Jeff?
Just to follow up on that, would you want to see this, the Compensation Act, included in an energy debate in July? Do you want to see this taken up sooner and separately? Leadership giving you any indication of or your own leadership where they want to go with that?
Really haven't had much discussion yet in terms of timing of all this. As you know, on the Democratic side, there's conversations going now about how they might advance some kind of an energy proposal. I understand the President will speak to that, or to his desire in terms of what a comprehensive energy bill should be, when it should be. Just being pragmatic. If we get into a debate this summer over cap and trade, we're going to be debating for quite a while. As somebody who, not being from the Gulf myself, but as being an Alaskan who has lived in a state that has been so negatively impacted by a spill, I want to make sure that the people in the Gulf know that we're not taking our eye off the ball when it comes to those measures that are going to provide them immediate relief, that are going to help them make their boat payment that is due, that's already past due, that they're going to be able to keep their small business instead of having to fold it. So I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that there are people hurting now that need our help. And if we can move forward independently, a measure or a series of measures that is going to help them, then that's what we need to be doing. Because if we get this all churned up in the middle of cap and trade, I'm afraid that we leave the people in the Gulf even more stranded than they feel currently.
Why do you feel the people of the Gulf Coast would do better with an adjudication process that is run by an administrator rather than through the federal court system or state court?
Well, one point would be attorney's fees. I can't tell you how many times I heard from Alaskans saying, yes, I finally got my settlement from Exxon, but the amount that I had to turn over to the attorneys just made it not that much of a victory. So attorney's fees are good. In our legislation, we limit the attorney's fees to 5% of the award to the victim. Another reason is I don't think people right now trust BP. BP is the one that is saying, submit your claim, you need to validate it, and we're going to pay all legitimate claims. Well, put yourself in their shoes. Are they really trusting that, okay, is BP going to truly be fair to me? Now, it may be an unjust accusation, but I think that that is part of the issue. Who do you trust right now? And I think if there were an independent administrator who is right there in your community, in your region, and you know you can go in and provide validation for your claim and get a response in a timely manner, in a 30-day turnaround, with an opportunity to appeal it if you think that they haven't considered everything, I think you're going to feel a little more comfortable about utilizing that type of a process than if you think it's just me up against the big oil company.
Does this, the process that this sets up, is this dealing only with economic damage claims filed by like local business owners, or does this touch on natural resource damages as well?
It is all economic damages claims. As you know, and somebody correct me, Kevin, didn't last week the limit on the natural resources claims, we increased that by UC? I thought that went through. Libby?
I was just saying that you can transfer from the emergency.
Okay. Okay. All right. What this does not deal with is the issue of punitives. But this does not preclude an individual. If you seek recourse through this claims process for your economic damages and you receive compensation and you have a subsequent claim, you would not be precluded from pursuing punitive damages.
You mentioned your ongoing efforts to find co-sponsors.
Mm-hmm.
Considering the widespread support for the Democrats' plan that you said to pull a very big number potentially out of the air, who are some of your allies in this? Other senators or outside groups that are firmly behind this action?
Well, what we have been doing is taking this draft proposal around, starting first with the Gulf Coast senators, because I think it's important that they know what it is that we are proposing, as well as other members of the Energy Committee, and ensuring that they fully understand the approach that has been taken. You know, keep in mind here, when you say that the Democrats' plan, to suggest that their plan is just to remove the liability cap and say we now have a plan to address the situation in the Gulf isn't really much of a comprehensive plan. It deals with one small aspect of it, but as I have raised, there's the potential for unintended consequences if you lift the liability cap altogether. There have been suggestions that in terms of availability of insurance then to companies who cannot self-insure, it will have an impact in terms of who is operating in the Gulf. And maybe that's something that we want to accept, but I think it is something that we at least look at and understand what the repercussions may be, that the only operators that we may have then in the Gulf are Saudi Aramco, China National Petroleum, Exxon. And if that's the way we want to go, you know, maybe that's the way we want to go, but we need to do it eyes wide open. And so I think that many members are looking for, okay, let's look at this in terms of a more comprehensive, well thought out policy, and one that is not just an emotional reaction to what we're seeing with the Deepwater Horizon. And it is very emotional. It absolutely is. But we need to ensure that the policies that we're going to put in place today long outlast the devastation that we're seeing unfold on a daily basis.
And have you been getting positive signals?
Yeah, we have. Yeah, we have. We were a little busy last week with the EPA resolution of disapproval, so we were juggling a lot of balls in the air, so it was difficult for me to get around and sit down with members one-on-one and talk about this. So, but I do think it is important to let people know that we are moving with a proposal that is considered and more comprehensive in scope. And as I say, we're continuing to look to fine-tune it. I'm going to have to excuse myself, but I thank you for the good questions and for your interest today. Thanks.
Nobody called me?
For him and all that, but the next night I ended up playing guitar for him, and that shit was crazy. I mean, it went off